Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Arfat and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd just like to share with you the general history of Islam. I'll not be going through this in a chronological order because I just want to highlight to you what is the history of Islam, basically. Um, I will speak about the intellectual, I will speak about the early conquest, I will speak about the different dynasty of Islam and how the Islamic Empire, how did it became so successful? How did it become so successful and unmatched and unparalleled for 1,000 years? And so first things first, we need to define our sources here. And there are two ways to approach the Islamic history. One is from the Western approach, and one is from the Islamic approach. Um, and I'll approach this back and forth. I'll do a comparison, and because it is not always the same conclusion. And in certain aspect, I reject the Western conclusion because the evidence outweighs the evidence from the Islamic historian themselves outweighs the Western evidences. Now, first things first, a lot of the early Islamic literatures were written in Arabic, um, and even though within the Islamic empire, we have multicultural and we have a multicultural and diverse society, more so than in the world today, um, because the Islamic empire at one point and during the Ottomans spread from Morocco all the way to China, and so it spreads across all these continents. And so this is actually something huge. And even the Taifa kingdom in Southeast Asia, they pledged allegiance to the Sultan earlier on, the Abbasid Sultan in Baghdad, as well as the Ottoman Sultan. And so we do have a lot of this history. But our sources about early Islam in Southeast Asia is very limited, and it is very unfortunate that we do not know a lot about Islam in Southeast Asia as compared to elsewhere. And that is because the Southeast Asians were not as developed early on compared to the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean have always been a center of intellectual discourses, especially Alexandria, founded by the Ptolemies. But even before that, the Egyptian dynasty, as well as the Mesopotamian, they have always been the more intellectual place or society or dynasty or empire. And the Southeast Asians were still living in we call it Dayak lifestyle in my native language. Basically, nomadic lifestyle. People will still live in the forest and things like that. And so we do not have any written. People do not write on paper, and so their early writings were on caves and wood and trunks like that, which do not stand the test of time. And so a lot of these early sources, if they did write at all, then probably would have really deteriorated due to it is not being able to preserve. The materials that they use do not withstand the test of time. And so our sources for Southeast Asian Islam, early Islam in Southeast Asia is very limited. The primary source is almost non-existent to begin with. And so it's very difficult to talk about Islam in the Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian continent. But we do know that Muslims were already in Indonesia by the time the Dutch came, and then the Malaya Peninsula were already Islamized, the people in Malacca and things like that, when the colonial powers came in, because they spoke about this, they wrote about this. They call us the Mohammedan, according to Western sources. But other than that, it's very difficult to know about how did Islam came to be and what were the early people like, their practices and things like that. But when it comes to the theological school, civilizations were pretty much more leading towards Imam Shafi'i, and that is how they spread. Because the Shafiq school, they spread to Southeast Asia, they spread down south and things like that. And so people have adopted the Imam Shafi'i school of thought in a sense. And pretty much when it comes to there's the school of jurisprudence, the school of thought, Southeast Asians are pretty much, I would say, the majority. They were Asharites, like majority of the people today. But we do have some strands of Mu'tazilites as well. People who accept only rational reasoning, like the philosophers and things like that. But that is not common as far as our sources can tell us, early sources. In Australia itself, we do not have any evidence until I would say the 19th century. Again, it is also difficult to know. So anyway, but we do have a lot, and I mean like really, really a lot of literatures, early literatures, like Tabari, Ibn Hisham, and all these things like that. When it comes to places other than the Southeast Asian continent, and so a lot of the Islamic historians or historians writing about Islamic history tend to focus more on these few continents rather than focusing on Southeast Asian, because there is not a lot of literature to begin with. But about a century ago, from where I'm from, we still write in the Arabic script. But people nowadays could not write in the Arabic script because ever since we gained independence, we adopted English as our main language, and so we wrote in the English alphabet, which is not the Semitic alphabet, so it's very different. But my mom could still write in Arabic, and my aunties could still write in Arabic because that is what they used to write when they were kid. And so either way, we know that the Arabic language became the main language when it comes to writing. It's just like that is the lingua franca of the Islamic Empire, just like Greek was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire in the East, and Latin and later Vulgate or Vulgar Latin, a more, I would say, a more concise Latin in the west of the Christendom, Roman Empire. So when Islam, early conquest of Islam, the early Arabs, before the Umayyads, they took over a lot of these, the continents around them. And then later the Umayyad dynasty took over, they Islamized majority of the Eastern Mediterranean, all the way from Morocco to Hind and China. Muhammad bin Qasim has early on, around 711, if I'm not mistaken, 712, defeated the Indian king there, and so Islam finally reaches the land of Hind in northern Pakistan today. And so it's also around this same time whereby Muslim traveled to Spain, southern Spain, Iberia, and then they started their own colony there. And so the spread of Islam, we can discuss this because the empire is so huge, and dedicated works have been written for specific period of a specific dynasty. Um, but one of my favorite era of the Islamic dynasty was actually the Mughal. The Mughal were started from they started because of Babur. He was the great grandson of Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, who himself claimed descendant from Genghis Khan, who plundered the world in the early 13th century. Um, and so, and then we also have the Shia dynasty in Al Qaeda in Cairo, starting with the Fatimids early on, and then the Safavids during the time of the Ottomans and the Mughal, the three gunpowder dynasty according to Western historian. Now, Western historian likes to divide. It likes to say that this is okay, the Mamluks in Egypt, okay, the Seljuks in Central Asia and things like that. But a lot of these early Muslims, they don't see it that way. They just see that, okay, this is just another people who have come to political power, but okay, this is just another government. But ironically, a lot of these different, like we have the Ayyubid dynasty, and then we have the Seljuks and things like that. We have a lot of proxy kingdoms, but they all pledge allegiance to the greater Abbasid ruler. And so this is not a division of the empire. It's just like you have a mayor, you have a different governor, and things like that. That is how, at least, in my opinion, the early Muslims see it. Even though there's fractions here and there, and these fractions actually was the reason why the Crusades were able to conquer in what we call today Palestine and Israel. And so, if only these proxy kingdoms have worked with one another, and instead of working against one another, some of them even betrayed by siding with the Crusades, and then they themselves were plundered by the Crusades, and things like that. And so we do see a lot of divisions. But during this time, the Islam were pretty much controlled by the Central Asians. We don't call them Iranians. We call them Persianized Persians, in a sense. And they're not Iranians like today Iranians, in a sense. After the Umayyads, the Arabs have completely lost control of the Islamic civilization. But we still have like proxy kingdoms here and there, but Arabs were not the majority of the ruler. And early on, the Western historians, early literature, when it comes to this, they like to use the word Arabs against Central Asians, against the Africans, and things like that. But the Islamic historians do not make these divisions, because we see them as one picture, and that they're Muslim. And so it is not about the Arabs, the Umayyads versus the Persian Abbasids, and things like that, because they were all Muslims. But some of them that we know were not necessarily great Muslims, because they broke the law of God and things like that. I'll not mention their names because they already died, and it's not good to bring up the sins of people. And so, the Western academic historians see things differently than what the Muslims themselves wrote about these people. And the division is that the conclusion is different. The Western historians see this, the reason why, because of the spread of Islam, the reason why Islam was able to spread so rapidly like Islam defeated both the Persians and the Romans within the Khulafa Rashidun. And so why is this? Why did Islam? How was Islam able to defeat? How did these Arabs were able to defeat this mighty empire? Or they gave reasons that the Persians and the Romans were in decline and things like that. But the Islamic historians say a completely different thing, because the Islamic historians say that this is the will of Allah, and this is in the Quran as well, Surah Al-Rum. But the Western historians, because they do not accept the concept of God, or they do not write in this way, and so their conclusion is different. But the Islamic historians knew that this is the will of Allah, because Allah had promised the believers that He will grant them victory over their enemies. And so the Arabs, with this at the back of their head, they have tawakkul of Allah, and so they fought, even though they were outnumbered 1 to 3, about 10,000 soldiers from the Arabs. Again, this is just an estimate, versus about 30,000 soldiers from the Romans and the Persians. Again, estimate. No one actually count. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No one actually count. This is just estimate. The numbers could be below, definitely not higher, because how did the early Muslims get 10,000 soldiers? That is not easy, especially in Arabia. And so the early armies must have not only been Arabs, they could have been Africans, they could have been Central Asians, because we know that trade routes, it could have even been Greek, for all we know. Because historians doubt this number, and I believe that this number is not accurate as well. Because how did you get 10,000 soldiers if it is only Arabs? And so it is difficult to accept this figure. But then we are not actually there. So there could have been 10,000 Arab soldiers, but I think it is more highly likely that it is made up of non-Arabs as well. And so that is why I rejected the Western opinion, in that I don't see this as Arabs versus Central Asians. It's just like Aurangzeb Alamgir. In his court, there were not only, or even Babur early on, there were not only Afghans in his court, or Turks in his court, or in his army. We have Indians as well in his army fighting. And so it is not, if one were to classify them as Arabs versus Central Asians versus Persians and things like that, then one ran into a huge difficulty. Rather, these are all Muslim armies, and non-Muslim were within the army as well, and things like that. We do have the Mamluks in Egypt. The Mamluks were actually very good, because they stopped Mongol from advancing further in northern Arabia. If not, more damage would have been done. But the Mongols themselves, having traversed all this land, their ancestors came to accept Islam. Timur was a Muslim, even though a lot of people say that he wasn't a good Muslim. But that is not why we are here, to judge people. As long as he's a Muslim, then Allah is the most merciful. He is very forgiving, the most forgiving. And so a lot of these historians in the West writing, they say that, Babur was, even though Babur wrote this himself, that he drank wine and things like that. Timur killed a lot of people, and so he could not have been a good Muslim. And so many other. Ibrahim Lodi, for example, he was a very bad figure. Mahmud Ghaznavi, for example, he was a tyrant ruler, and so. But that is the Western approach. They need to include that in, and for some reason they do need to include that in, even though it doesn't help their narrative. But because they're writing, they have this animosity towards Islam, even though it is slightly toned down, but they still need to mention things like that because they're writing for popular audience. Whereas if you read the Christian literature, and I've read a lot of Christian literature, Christian history as well, you do not find this sort of polemics because they do not help in their narrative. So what if Babur drank wine? So what? What does it help with the political history that you are writing? Um, you're actually venturing into theology here. Um, and so those remarks I found to be unnecessary. And that is actually a dig at Muslims. Um, but anyway, it is still found in the Western literature writing about Islam. Um, um, but they themselves blame the Islamic historians as being too overzealous for the historical figure. Like if you read the accounts of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi from the Eastern, I mean from the Islamic perspective, and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi from the Western perspective, um, even though they cite the Islamic historians who wrote about Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, um, you have a different Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And so which Salahuddin Ayyubi would you want to believe? Um, Same, you have a different figure about Aurangzeb al-Alamgi, written by Hindu historian, and written by Western historian, and written by Islamic historian. So which Aurangzeb Alamgi would you want to take? Um, Same way, especially about the Prophet ﷺ, and his companions. Do you want to take the Western Prophet, the historical figure, or would you want to take the Eastern Prophet as a historical figure? Which one would you write? Which one would you take? Would you take Ibn Hisham's account, or would you reject Ibn Hisham's account as non-historical? And that is the Western approach. Would you reject the Sealed Nectar, written by Sheikh Mubarak Puri, or would you take the Sealed Nectar as a historical narrative about Rasulullah, or would you take the Western approach, the Prophet that has undergone through historical criticism? Same way, would you take the Islamic Jesus, or would you take the Western Jesus? So which Jesus would you take? Now you see the difficulty in the sources here, or in the conclusions. And because the Islamic Jesus and the Western Jesus is a completely different Jesus. Completely different Jesus. May peace of Allah be upon him. The Western Jesus is a crucified Jesus, an insurgent Jesus, Jesus that came to strike a political movement against the Romans. Even though in the text, the New Testament says that my kingdom is not in this world. Or would you take the Islamic Jesus, whereby he was very kind to his parents, he was a very soft-hearted figure, he was very zealous of the law, Allah assisted him, he was born miraculously, there was no such thing as Joseph the carpenter. Or would you take the Western Jesus, whereby he was a crucified person, Joseph was his father, he wasn't born miraculously, because miracles don't happen. Or would you take the Islamic Muhammad SAW? He traveled to he received divine revelation, or the Western Muhammad SAW, that he wrote the entire Quran, or the Quran was copied from the New Testament. And so which authority would you take? That depends on you. But anyway, I could go on and compare literature about Islamic civilization from written from the account of a Muslim, and written from the account of secular, non non-religious person, and things like that. Um, the fact is, personally, I weave between the two literature. I don't necessarily accept all the Islamic literature, especially about historical figures, and I don't always accept Western conclusion about the Prophet or Salam, about all these thing, because you do need to study from both angle, because the Western historical method is actually a very good method that they have developed, and the Islamic historians are often filled with bias, and for me, I just want to know the figure as to who he really was. Obviously, there is no way to know. For example, there is no way to know who Ibn Arabi really was. Okay, what did he like to eat, and things like that. There is no way to know for us. There is no way for us to know the true Al-Biruni, for example, even though he was a polymath and things like that. He worked in Mahmud al-Ghaznavi court. He or Ibn Battuta, for example. We know that he traveled to India, for example. He became the judge in India, for example. He became a scholar in India. And so Ibn Battuta of the Islamic historian is completely different from the Ibn Battuta of the Western historians. The Islamic civilization, as narrated by a Muslim scholar, is different from the Western secular non-religious scholar. And so we do need to weave between the two. And this is just history. These are just histories. And it doesn't have any theological bearing. So I don't find it a problem to weave between the two sources and see which one is more aligned. Because you do need, because everyone is filled with bias, including ourselves. And so that is what I actually do. I don't believe in any of the accounts that is written by both the Islamic sources as well as the Western sources, because this is not something that is bearing on my theology. And so I don't accept these two sources unless we have authentic sources like the hadiths, for example, multiple attested sources, for example. Then that is something that we can actually believe, like hadiths, for example, mutawatir, for example, multiply attested sources, independent of one another, and early through through a sound rijal, the chain of narration, the chain of transmission. And all these people who narrate are not kadhab, they're not liars, they're not, their memory is good, for example. And so that is something that we should take a look at. But that is something that the Western historical methods have not been able to actually to do. Even though some of them, like the criterion of dissimilarity, for example, but I found the Islamic method to be more rigor, and that is something that the Western field of academia can actually look and incorporate into their study. But if they do that, then basically we'll have to take the entire New Testament and throw it out. And so that is something that they're not willing to do. And so if you understand what I'm talking about, I do not want to elaborate because this is a very boring subject. But for those of you who know historical methods or historiography, and for those of you who know the Ilmu Rijal, for example, the Western methods are no way close to how rigor the Islamic methods actually is. when it comes to identifying true source. Um, yeah, but sometimes I wonder why this is so. Why the Western academic have not actually incorporate this method. But then again, I understand because if they do that, then they need to be consistent. Then the entire New Testament or even the Bible must be thrown out of the window. But that is something that they're not willing to do. And I don't think that it should be done because this is actually not a nice thing to do. Um, for those of you who know textual criticism and things like that. Um, and so we should be more tolerant. We shouldn't take any scripture and throw it out the window. No, we shouldn't do that because that is very disrespectful. Lakum dinukum waliyadin. But anyway, my name is Arfat, and I encourage you to learn about Islamic history. Inshallah, I'll do a book recommendation on every single dynasty of Islam. It's gonna be a very long video. If you guys want that, I can do that. I can recommend you literature about that because Islamic history is something that I read, I enjoy on the side. Um, but I don't see any problem incorporating Islam into my YouTube videos as well because it helps with the da'wah. But anyway, my name is Arfat and I'll see you on my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.